Good afternoon. What I'm going to share with you are some thoughts and reflections, not on the latest treatments themselves, but on the transformation that's taking place for patients and how they participate in those clinical trials. My work at Pfizer and my work today is always themed less around the molecules and more around the process of how we're developing our medicines. And there are 10 areas that I'm going to share with you over the next few moments that will hopefully bring us all along this journey of how that transformation is proceeding. As was mentioned, I was previously at Pfizer. I have a number of affiliations today, both as an advisor and growth advisor in this field, but also with a number of organizations at the intersection of patient advocacy, large data, and healthcare delivery. So, starting from the top, the first place where we're seeing a transformation in the role of patients and how they're participating in trials is in how we're designing trials themselves. Now, I would argue that there are some remarkable transformation steps that are upstream of there that I'm not going to talk about. Transformation in how patients are changing the medicines themselves that are getting funded, how venture philanthropy is supporting the reprioritization of molecules that are getting into the clinic itself. But for this narrative, I'm going to start from when those molecules are actually getting ready to enter clinical trials. Now, historically, companies like mine in the past simply engaged with physician key opinion leaders. But today, there is a renaissance of engaging with patients for input into how our studies are being designed. But today, there's a tremendous amount of inconsistency in how that's happening. It's inconsistent in terms of what molecules are getting patient input into the design of those studies. It's inconsistent in how drug developers are engaging with patients. Should that be with advocacy groups, online communities, groups of clinical trial alumni, patients off the street, or some convergence of all of the above? I think as we look at where this trend is going, though, we'll see increased consistency and increased roles for the true spirit of co-development. It was Sharon Terry from the Genetic Alliance who had schooled me on the idea that it's great that you're inviting patients to the table, but you in industry have to get to a place of appreciating that it wasn't your table to invite people to in the first place. And I think that that's an awakening moment for folks inside of life sciences companies. A second area has been the transformation in how patients are finding out about trials themselves. And most of us are used to the day when we relied heavily on newspaper, television, radio, and today increasingly much of the recruitment effort and budget might get shifted to different online channels or uses of community. But the ultimate shift that I think many in the industry are aligning around is the spirit of bringing clinical research as a care option. And I think Dr. Hudas had pointed to some of this opportunity as well just a moment ago. Today's clinical trial participation requires and relies on serendipity. The idea that the targeted patient that was right for a trial happened to go to the doctor who happened to have been invited to be an investigator in that trial. And the idea that technology alone can solve this, I believe, is a fallacy. Technology will be an important enabler for identifying those patients, but the problems run much deeper in terms of addressing the economic and emotional incentives that are required to enable one physician to take the time to talk to their patient about a trial that's being led by another physician, maybe in a different health system entirely, across the street, across town, and encourage them to participate, or at least raise awareness so they can make an informed decision. And that's the spirit of this concept of clinical research as a care option. How do we start to bridge that divide and those misaligned incentives? A third area I'll point to is around trial access. And traditionally, trials have represented a tremendous burden in time and an economic burden for patients in terms of travel. That barrier around travel is also a driver of the disparities that we see in terms of who is able to take the time off from work in order to travel to an investigator site to participate. Clearly, individuals who are on salaried jobs are not going to be able to take a day off and forego income in order to participate in a clinical trial. Now today, many life sciences companies are embracing the use of different digital technologies, video and otherwise, to try to enable some in-home and remote participation. I think where this movement is going over time will be a choose-your-own-adventure model for clinical research participation, and enabling not of a trial that's all in a clinic or a trial that's all in the home, but enabling patients to have choice in how and where they participate on any given visit. Today I might want to go to the supermarket to buy my groceries. Tomorrow I might want to order for online delivery, but just because I chose it one way yesterday doesn't mean that should be the way I'm participating for life. That's a challenge, the way we develop our medicines today, in large part because our endpoints are so fragile. They require meticulous monitoring by a trained investigator and their staff, and the idea that we could consistently measure a patient's outcome across different disease areas, whether they're in the clinic or at home, is in some cases unimaginable. But that's the future that we need to enable, and the steps are there. When I was at Pfizer way back in 2011, I had the opportunity to design and help lead one of the industry's first clinical trials that took place entirely in the home. This in overactive bladder, the outcome of which we published in 2014. We were not able to successfully complete that trial back then, but there has been a resurgence of enthusiasm in this category among life sciences companies, as well as among technology companies and investors. And so it is only a matter of time before this gains increased attention and adoption. As was mentioned earlier, the innovative idea here isn't the hard part, it's the willingness to change and adapt. Patient support while they're in a trial, I believe, is also seeing transformation, helping patients beyond just the role of a study coordinator of yesterday. Today, many trials are incorporating different types of support programs, including local travel support for patients. But I think where we see this trend going is around the use of digital to support in a more concierge-like way, whether it's Hey Siri, Hey Google. I'm almost afraid to say that too loud for fear of how many phones might wake up. But along with that is the transformation in the endpoints themselves. Traditionally, the endpoints we've relied on for our studies have been purely scientific and driven to answer the clinical and scientific questions. And the renaissance today, largely driven by the FDA through patient-focused drug development, has been to rethink the endpoints that are also important to the patients themselves. As we see those endpoints maturing, this is where we'll see increased roles for digital as a mechanism for more passive data capture, digital that can help in that digital endpoint capture that we were talking about earlier, that can start to break down those geographic barriers as well. Because if we have a better endpoint, then we can start to enable more options for how and where patients participate. Now, there's people use this term centricity a lot, patient centricity, this centricity. Clearly, our trials today and yesterday have all been centered around the trial themselves. Patients enroll in a trial. The trial is clearly at the center of that sentence. I think as we're looking forward, we see opportunities starting to come together for how research is actually supporting the patient rather than the other way around. And here are two signals that I think are why I believe that future is on its way. I think we just heard a moment ago about an example around master protocols and ways in which umbrella and bucket studies are creating incredible opportunities with strong FDA support for how we're developing our medicines differently. Rather than the traditional approach of building up infrastructure to test one medicine and one indication, and then breaking all of that infrastructure down at the last study visit, master protocols are emerging to let us create reusable and sustaining infrastructure that can test multiple molecules concurrently under one data infrastructure, one recruitment infrastructure. In parallel, there are amazing, what I would call all-comer big data observational studies that are taking place, like the All of Us program at the NIH or Project Baseline with Google and Verily. And I think that you can start to envision a convergence between these two worlds. You can start to envision how, on the one hand, we have these all-comer trials that are enrolling diverse patient populations, but the data that they're capturing is remarkably rich, whether molecular, sourcing EHR data, having patients self-report, or using different types of wearables and sensors in the context of that study. And so rather than just envisioning those as registries, from which maybe we'll pull patients out and drop them into another trial, we can start to envision how they themselves become master protocols, and how we can start to simply randomize patients who are in those studies to an intervention or to a control. And when that experience ends, keep them in that observational study in an ongoing way. If you've followed some of the progress that Apple has done, just a couple of months ago, they released the Apple Research app, which in some ways demonstrates how feasible that can be. Because the Apple Research app isn't an app for patients in one particular study. It's an app for patients to support their participation in research, period. So with my Apple Research app, I not only have access to my data, but I can see different studies for which I'm eligible and participate in multiple studies from within one app. I can see the different tasks or visits that may be required of me across multiple studies in one app. So all of a sudden, I become the center of that research experience. It is not about me as a patient joining a trial. It starts to become the other way around. Within a life sciences company, we think about deliverables. That's the end stage of all of that research that we're doing. It's deliverables for internal decision making, deliverables for regulators, deliverables for payers. It's why we're doing the research, what we want to come out of it. But historically, we've thought very little about what deliverables should be going back to the patients themselves who are participating. Now, today, there are many organizations that are starting to return study results in patient-friendly ways back to the patients who participated in those trials. Going forward, that will be not only a story about individual results, but the individual's data itself. And that makes sense. When you look at the context, that 9 out of 10 patients have indicated that they want to know the outcome of the study in which they participated, but the vast majority do not get access to that. Now, granted, most of the life sciences companies today are consistently publishing their results in scientific literature, but most patients cannot access those journals, and they can't access that information in terms of the way it's written. And so the renaissance here for sponsors to strategically consider the deliverables that their patients need, to make sure that they're getting that they're getting summaries of the study results that are published, but also ways to get them back their own individual data. That was some work that I had driven at Pfizer, where we did pilots using the blue button that was being developed and used in so many other areas around healthcare delivery, and working together with the Harvard Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center, MRCT, produced this white paper describing pathways for returning individuals' study results, in some cases during the trial, and then the remainder at study end, making it very realistic for companies to see a path towards that, even in a blinded randomized trial. Some final thoughts outside of a randomized trial. I think that we're seeing a renaissance around patient participation in registries, where registry in the past meant a physician re-entering data into a database. And registries today is kind of a confusing hybrid of terms. In some cases, it's the mechanism of a physician re-entering data in a database. In some cases, patients themselves are re-entering data into databases. And in some cases, that data is being sourced directly from medical records. Going forward, you can start to see pathways where patients themselves are the mediators of their health data, controlling where it goes and being able to simply share that data into the registries of their choice, just like with that Apple Research screen I showed a moment ago. Likewise, there's some tremendous enthusiasm in this room and very thoughtful commentary that's been taking place all week around the use of real-world data in clinical research, where today, yesterday, so much of that was around study planning, was around how we can use data for epidemiology. Today, so much is very exciting about regulatory submissions off of that data. But tomorrow, we have to find pathways for that data to be adequately permissioned. We can't worry as individuals that our digital twins are being synthesized from aggregated data resources and enrolled into clinical trials without our knowledge. because that's a reality that's right around the corner with the enthusiasm and adoption of synthetic control arms, which is a remarkable pathway for use of real-world data. We can't let that drift far from patients themselves. And as a final note, in my final seconds around compassionate use, which traditionally has actually been a very disruptive requirement for many pharma companies who are so focused on trying to generate evidence around their investigational medicines that when compassionate use requests come in, they can be very disruptive. But going forward, as was mentioned a moment ago, how can those compassionate use requests actually turn into enabling and supporting pathways for generating more evidence about what may be working for patients? And as a final note, one consistent theme across all 10 of these areas, we need to ensure that patients are in complete control of where their data is going. And for this room, we really need to make sure that our aspirations around data science, regulatory science, and precision medicine do not pull in the opposite direction of our desires for patient engagement and patient centricity. We have to make sure that we don't slip into a digital era of Henrietta Lacks, believing that simply because we're doing what we believe is right with an individual's data, that that's adequate. Fortunately, there are pathways emerging for us to include patients in those decisions, and we have to make those a reality. Thank you very much.